the time. Take it all.
We realize that something is very essential the moment we're deprived of it. The moment something constant is stripped away, we realize it's something that we need very much. It happened in Egypt, when during Arab Spring they experienced that. It happened in Syria during the uprisings. It happened here when we just arrived into Caprice and experienced deprivation of connectivity. So what here the government bench is trying to actually explain and deliver and convey is that we are for equality, we're for equal opportunity, and we're here to tackle the digital divide in the world. Therefore, we believe that access to the internet should become a fundamental human right. So, therefore, we will answer two basic questions to convince you that our position is absolutely right. First of all, we'll explain to you why and when something is recognized as a fundamental human right, describing you the evolution of the human rights and showing you the links between the development of the communities, of the countries, and the access to the internet. Secondly, we will demonstrate the positive implications and externalities of making the internet access a fundamental human right. Later, please. So firstly, let's talk about the evolution of a fundamental human right. So along with our needs and along with our capacities, our moral vision of the world expands. The way we see things, the way we treat things, everything changes and extends. For example, right to security has not been as such before we realized that we can actually ensure security around the globe when we invented arms, when we invented armies, when we actually realized that countries are capable of doing that. Right to drinking water was not as such before we realized that we actually can make filters, when actually we said that we realized that we can supply the world with drinking water. The same with the internet is that right now there is a trend that internet is widely used, and that we have this opportunity to provide the entire world with access to the internet. Yes, Manos?
Yeah, the key difference between the internet and water and things like that being that the internet is an unnecessary condition for humans to stay alive.
Is it so? Is it so? Something like education is also is not essential for us to actually survive. But we recognize a fundamental human right. Something may not be practiced around the globe, but we still recognize a fundamental human right just because we want the government to push forward, to try their best to ensure that human right for all the population. Later. I'd like to mention, I'd like to here stop a little bit and talk about the evolution of the human rights along the history. We have 3 generations of rights. We have first generation of rights, civil and political rights. We have second generation of rights, economic, social, cultural rights, and we have the third generation of rights, which include collective and group rights, including right to information. We see that these generations of rights evolved along our needs and actually expanded along our capabilities. So here today, we're trying to prove that internet, we're at the point where access to the internet should be recognized as a fundamental human right. Yes?
So what, does the government also permit regulation of the internet?
This is something which is actually not really necessary here. What we're saying here is that the government should try their best actually to provide access. When something is recognized as a fundamental human right, when something is actually recognized as a fundamental human right, it will increase the moral burden of the leaders of those authoritarian states or any state to control the internet or to limit access. What if we do not recognize internet as a fundamental human right? In that case, any government can restrict access just because it's not a right. Just because it's something that is not recognized as a fundamental right. So why don't we recognize it and enable people to actually access information, access education, and many other things that I'm going to talk about right now. So here, we're coming to the positive implications of recognizing internet as a human right. First of all, we believe that human right encompasses many other freedoms and rights. They are freedom of speech and expression, something obvious, right? Their right to development. Actually, many countries already recognize that even access to the mobile phones helps communities to develop. What opportunities can access to the internet bring? they're immense, they're actually indefinite. So we believe that if we would like to decrease the digital divide and give people opportunity to develop, we have to recognize internet access as a fundamental human right. Because those who use internet, who have access to the internet, are much more privileged than those who are deprived of that access. They're actually in more superior position than those who are deprived of that access. And let's move on. Right to freedom of assembly. The internet is a public space. And just like any square in any town, we believe that we have to provide access to the internet. While the opposition side may say that, hey, square is not a fundamental human right, but we cannot actually think of right to assembly without access to that square. While access to that square is not a physical, like access to that physical town square may not be considered a human right in actually isolation, it has always been an integral part and inseparable from that right to assembly. That is the same with the internet. Yes, Logan? Oh, I'm sorry. I have only 1 minute, I'm sorry. Right to family and private life. Internet has become something we cannot actually live without. Due to globalization, people move around, people go to other countries to work, people migrate to other countries, and they need this access and need this opportunity to actually stay in touch with their families. They keep their banking accounts, they keep their passwords, they keep their entire life online. So since this internet actually evolved so much, this internet comprises all our spheres, we believe that access to the internet should be fundamental just because it's not a tool. We cannot compare internet to the hammer and nail. Well, maybe some wires and broadbands can be compared to hammer and nail. But internet is more of a house, it's more of something like a right to shelter rather than just a tool to enable our rights. Therefore, today, we prove that due to evolution of rights, due to evolution of needs and capacities, we actually may change our attitude towards human rights. And we showed you the positive implications of making access to the human right a fundamental. Therefore, we are proud to propose.
I don't know. Ladies and gentlemen, there's going to be a two-pronged opposition case from the opening opposition. First prong, second prong. But in my speech, I'm going to talk about two fundamental things. One, this notion of fundamental. What is fundamental, what's not fundamental. And we're going to give you a standard, other than Sherzod saying it's part of rights have evolved and we've become different and now everything that we like is a fundamental human right. We think that's wrong. But secondly, I'm also going to tell you why that's harmful, why that makes the prioritization of rights a problem, and why that dilutes other rights which we think are more important. I'm glad Shams agrees with my strategy. But briefly, what did Sherzod tell you? He told you that at one point we had very little rights and few things, and then we had more, and then we had more, and then we had even more. But he didn't really tell you how the internet per se is different from all of these other things, and why it deserves a special classification compared to, say, the newspaper, or compared to, say, other forms of tools that need to make it fundamentally different from these other things. Because our position is that it is a tool. It is a tool that grants that we all like, that is incredibly useful, that makes us pretty happy, but that's pretty much it, right? Now it may help you get access to some of these other rights, and here they will talk about this notion of rights, right? Before I've started, sure, Shams, go.
So if it's not called a right, oppressive governments can just say, we are not granting it, it is not a right, we are going to switch off the internet and get away with that.
I wish Sherzod answered the point of information that Yuan asked, because that's exactly what he asked. Yuan said, is it okay to regulate the internet? And Sherzod said, not important. Very important. Because that's one of the things that distincts the rights. And this is going to nicely into my two standards of rights, which is firstly that a fundamental right is irrevocable and undeniable, and secondly, it is inherent to the actual existence of survival. So let's look at some of the things they talked about. Manos asked a somewhat good question about water, or responded to that point, right? And he said, oh, you know, there's water, there's existence, there's all the other things, but you can't at any level, it's never justifiable to not give water to someone. Even if that person's accused of killing like 1,000 people, you will give them water, okay? But not yet. But you can, in some situations, remove access to the internet, right? Now, so those are the things which we consider absolutely fundamental human rights. But then there are other things like healthcare or like education, which are things that he brought up and said, if a government denies education to someone or denies healthcare to someone, we think that's denying people their fundamental rights. And we think like those things people have a little bit of a distinction over. We don't think people should be denying them education, should be denying them healthcare, because those things are, if you don't get that, you cannot inherently survive, right? You need to get treatment, otherwise you will die. So you need to get that treatment. If you don't learn how to get a job, and then you will fail. Now, they haven't told us why the internet is that important, okay, other than some broad level of assertions, right? So in situations where governments can remove some of those things, those are not considered fundamental human rights abrogations. And we think that's what's important, because you can regulate the internet, and then sometimes you can turn off the internet. Some countries, liberal, like when the UK riots were underway, the government did consider, or at some points did, shut down things that people who were spreading violence or rumors of violence through the internet, and were considering not allowing those things to spread. So even in incredibly democratic countries, not just these totalitarian regimes, do we shut off the internet, right? So they have to come up here and draw this clear line. No, thank you. But let me then go on, and now that we've told you what is fundamental, what's not fundamental, and actually provided a pretty cool standard, I'm going to tell you why it's harmful for us to lump all of these different things together. Because firstly, is you create the idea that it is inherently and totally good, okay? And we think the internet isn't inherently and totally good. Just like the right to drive, it is a right that needs to be educated and needs to be used responsibly, because we don't think that people should be on the internet 24 hours. We think there are some pretty dangerous things on the internet. Children shouldn't be on the internet all the time. Some adults shouldn't be on the internet all the time. There are sites, for example, that encourage suicide that exist on the internet. There are all of these different things on the internet that aren't fundamentally good. And if something isn't completely fundamentally good, like water, we think then in that situation, you don't say it is inherently good. Yes, Bianca?
But is freedom of speech always inherently good?
Freedom of speech can be regulated, okay? So, which is a standard, which is something I hope a line that they will take. At some point, democratic states can shut off freedom of speech, okay, and say that you can't say these things in public, right? So we think that at the very sort of core minimal level, if you say that people should have freedom of speech, then a state shouldn't completely deny a person the ability to speak. But should a state say every tool in which you then can speak with is a fundamental human right? So it is my fundamental human right to be able to broadcast my speech on television. It is my fundamental human right to be able to have giant billboards of myself. It is my fundamental human right to be able to run around with slogans painted on my chest. No, those things are not fundamental human rights, and they need to make that distinction. But secondly, we say the second harm is that it dilutes things which we do consider fundamental human rights. These totalitarian regimes, which they're so upset about, like China, switching off the internet, do a lot more worse things, guys. And if you can't draw the priority and focus on the things that you want to do, all of these different things end up getting lumped together. And then people in those totalitarian regimes would say, look at these, very rich, happy people with their smartphones, and they think if you can't check on Facebook once a day, your rights will die. Ha ha ha. And we think that's problematic. right? So if you want to educate the world on what are fundamental rights, and you want people to then be able to distinct those things, and someone says, yeah, I don't have internet access, in fact, I don't even have a car, and I can't drive road, but I still have the right to speak, and those things are fundamental. I have the right to move, and those things are fundamental. You don't have to give me a car, but you can't stop me from going somewhere where I want to go. You don't have to give me this megaphone, but you can't stop me from speaking or criticizing or saying those things. And those are the lines and the distinctions that we need to draw. Because it's nice to say that everyone should be able to access the internet, but calling it a fundamental human right is different. Those things are really, really special.
Ladies and gentlemen, what is our bar for calling something a fundamental human right? Because this side seems to think it has to be essential to your survival. If we take it away, you will languish, you will suffer, you will die. It is essential at every single moment, every single instance that the right can be allocated. Maybe if we were in the 1970s, yes. But the world's moral imagination has expanded since then. You know, we all have a right to marry. That's a fundamental human right. I will not die if I can't marry. We all have a right to free speech. I am not going to die if I can't say what I think every time. The neo-Nazis are not going to die if they can't say what they think, but the First Amendment protects it. We have a right to basic schooling. We're not going to die if we don't have access to basic schooling. It's not essential in every single situation. Some people find jobs without basic schooling. But we recognize that at this stage of our social evolution, life can qualitatively be better and create more equal opportunities for everyone if this particular resource, the way education and healthcare are allocated, is allocated equally. Second question they ask us, do we want to regulate the internet? Why do they want to ask this question? Because if we say that when states regulate the internet, and sometimes they do, they're going to say that means it's no longer a right. That's not true. They agreed that free speech is a right, a fundamental one. And then they contradicted themselves in their speeches when they said, but states regulate free speech too. Does that mean we don't call it a fundamental right anymore? France regulates hate speech. Germany does. Other states have censorship regimes. Does that mean we should back down and say it's not a right? No. In fact, we should move in the opposite direction and push them to open barriers to access instead of being cowed by their regulation. The converse is worse. Please sit down. Because if you say it's not a right, then you affirm their rhetoric that it is not essential. I'm going to address the dilution of political capital argument in a bit. The third thing they say is, it shouldn't be a right because the internet is not an absolutely good thing. You have things like child porn and other things like that. Free speech is not an absolutely good thing as well. You have supremacists, you have child porn, you have all these breaches of, of human dignity that happens. But we err on the side of preserving it, maybe regulating it if necessary, because we recognize that on balance, the world is still a better place with it than without it. They've never told us that in the greater likelihood of cases, or even in a significant majority of cases, the internet is a bad thing. When you have family members who work overseas, in this age of labor diasporas, tell me why you are not entitled to the internet as part of your base to realize your right to communication. The fourth thing they say is, political capital is limited because we're prioritizing our advocacy for internet freedom instead of telling China and other people to do other things. Well, what are we allowed to do as an external observer, as the rest of the world? We cannot force them to liberalize traditional media. That's not going to happen. We're not there. We cannot force them to not crack down on demonstrators. That's not going to happen. We're not there. Where do we start? A good place to start is to force them, or at least to help breach, because we become duty-bound, to breach their internet walls the moment it's a right. And if we help breach those things, we trigger the start of that revolution. I'd like to point you to case studies of Egypt, or even Iran, when there was that successful half revolution, which happened on Twitter. What do you expect to do? Where are you going to use your political capital? How are you going to push them to move in what direction? What is your plan? Yes?
If you claim that freedom of speech has been a fundamental human right and all this moral burden exists, how come we've been uniquely unable to convince China, for instance, to have a free press over the past 30 years?
So what direction should we move in, right? Should we move in pushing it continuously by insisting that it is a right? By the way, China has signed the UN resolution saying the internet is a right. Or should we just give up and say, oh, it's not a right, you can do whatever you want? We don't get to realize everything we call a fundamental right. Water isn't available in some countries. Maternal health care isn't available in some countries. That doesn't mean we stop calling it a right. In fact, that means we should keep calling it a right to lend moral force to claims to be happen. day and age, the internet is essential to realizing that right. Because a broad guarantee of free speech is not enough. In this age of big media conglomerates, in this age where, you know, the free market of ideas isn't so free after all, because to get to publish a newspaper you need to have lots of money, you need to meet editorial standards, to get online you might need to have to get on air you might need to have connections where media companies collude with states all the time. The best, most democratic way to realize your free speech is through the internet, which is a medium that is very accessible to a lot of people. That's why that's the direction we should be moving in, and that's what we should be pushing for. I don't know what their plan is to make the world a better place, but we will insist that the internet is not simply a tool. The medium is essential to the delivery. The medium and the message are actually intertwined now. You actually need the internet to realize the right to free speech. There is no way we are genuinely respecting the right to free speech in this day and age if we don't respect the internet as a right. The second thing I want to talk about is a digital divide. Because when you look at the internet, that is a side... Oh, before I go on, yeah.
But we need to do more than say it's good for people. Why is it a fundamental thing that draws a distinction from other rights that we would sanction a country for?
The deprivation of the internet in places where free speech is really important is crucial. We already say free press is a fundamental right. We already say free speech is a fundamental right. We are lumping this in that category of rights and saying that it is essential when you recognize these other rights to recognize this. But let's talk about the digital divide. Why do we provide free basic schooling to people who can't afford it? Why do we provide free transportation to people who don't own cars, for example? Because we recognize that we want to create a world where there are equal opportunities. Most of the jobs and most of the hiring processes now happen online. A lot of communication processes and crucial information you can find in this world are all online. There's a massive difference between people who have access to the internet and the opportunities they have in life, between them and the people who do not. And that is a gap the state must bridge. You do things like progressive taxation all the time. You do things like subsidize important needs. The internet is that next frontier. We do make the argument that if you do not have regular access to the internet, you are massively disadvantaged in terms of education outcomes, in terms of job outcomes, in terms of life opportunities. So yes, the state shouldn't coddle you and give you everything, but its job was to create equal opportunities. And part of our social landscape now, part of the formula for success, is having access, or even just survival in some cases, is having access to this particular resource, which is why we should call it a right, because calling it a right has powerful implications. Woo!
I think everybody has seen me naked already, so I don't need to take no. Ladies and gentlemen, I feel ashamed of this team. You know why I feel ashamed? Because after ages and ages of people fighting for things like not being killed on the street because you're a woman, or not being stoned to death because you're a woman, they come and say, well, you know, the freedom to actually go online and look videos of cute kitties is fundamental. Well, first of all, let's go what they say. They come and tell us that, you know, the moral imagination has evolved without actually going into how it has evolved and why internet is actually essential. They go and say, well, you know, they seem not to understand that fundamental need means necessary. And as Logan has pointed out, they have never been proven why it's fundamental, why you need it. They said, yeah, it's good, it's fun, it's interesting, but they never came into telling us why we need it. And we think they will fail to do that intentionally. Then Shams comes and says, well, you know, the right to marry is fundamental. I cannot marry other men. The right to marry is not fundamental, and in these cases, fine, let's sanction all the states. Let's sanction all the states like the US, who doesn't let me go and marry a man, okay? Then they come and say, well, you know, actually regulation is okay. Shazad doesn't know what he's talking about. We're obviously agreeing with you guys. Well, no, sorry, too late. Oh, but then again, China will do that as well. China will constantly just regulate it. Just because it's a right and you give the access to it, doesn't mean that all the benefits come. They come and say, well, you know, the freedom of speech can be taken away, so it's fine if we just take away sometimes from the internet as well. So China will just keep taking away. We'll give you access to like the page of how China's awesome, and otherwise you can go somewhere else to find it. Okay? Sure.
So China violates free speech. They crack down on demonstrators. Should we not call those things rights too?
Okay, but just because something should be called rights doesn't mean it always happens. Second of all, you can't say Shizot comes and says, well, you know, you have to make it fundamental right because then all of these states, the evil states, will be forced to give you this right. When she just agreed that they won't. She just agreed that China, Iran, and North Korea will never care of what you're doing, okay? So then, what do? They go like, oh, your family's abroad, you need internet. You can take a plane and visit your mom, okay? Do that. Don't use the internet as a cheap excuse not to talk to your parents. Take a phone, okay? Then she goes, and you know, it's the best form for freedom of speech. First of all, that's not true. We think that the internet cheapens the freedom of speech. Why? Because there's so much information out there. And also, it gives you the opportunity to send out that speech that they agreed should be banned because it's bad speech, like hate speech. It gives you the opportunity to spread all those things among the world. So we don't think that it's the best way for freedom of speech. We think that the internet cheapens speech because, you know, people can put oh, look at these video cute kitties. This is my freedom of speech. No. Okay, so let me talk to you about different things. First of all, let me tell you the difference between the freedom of speech and the internet. First of all, the freedom of speech, sure, we sometimes can take it away from you, yeah? But it's a difference between me coming and tying your mouth for the rest of your life so you can't speak, or me taking away your internet. People have survived and continue to survive without the internet absolutely fine. They thrive, they're happy, they have met many children, and they're all absolutely fine. No. Yeah, so, but the problem is, when we take the internet away, nothing really happens. But you need a freedom of speech to be able to communicate with other people, and to be able to communicate your ideas, please. To communicate your ideas so that everybody else can actually see them, right? And they keep saying that, oh, well, you know, we take some other rights sometimes as well. But just because we take some other rights doesn't mean we should give you the internet. But on the other side, we must understand that you do not need the internet to have a fulfilled and happy life. You need water to have a life. You need food to have a life. You need protection to have a life. You need to be able to move around to have a life. You do not need the internet. If the internet would just stop working right now, all of us will be fine. We've been here so many days and we survived so well and we're having so much fun without the internet. We don't need to Facebook and Twitter and tag ourselves every single day to be happy, okay? Then again, let's talk about how these, you know, authoritarian states would actually react to these things. First of all, we think that the moment that the West comes and says, well, you know, the right to internet, it has to be fundamental, many states will have the reaction of like, no, just because the state says so, I'm going to be China and just I'm going to like disrespect everything just because the West says so. We think many authoritarian states do not like being told, you need to do this. And we think they have, no, you've been asking me too many questions. And we think that authoritarian states will actually actively not offer this access because it wants to act against the West. And we think that forcing these states to give you that right makes them think that there's something wrong there. There's something that, you know, other states want to somehow infiltrate us, you know, change us from within. So we think it's easier for them to give access the moment they think that, you know, oh no, it's fine, because it's communist and it's good. Not because the universal declaration of human rights would say that it's fundamental. Also on the point of cheapening other rights. This is the problem. It's not about just like having a huge list of 100 fundamental rights that we want. The problem is when you put the fundamental right of internet there, with the rights such as water, such as, let's say, even if getting married would be a fundamental right, you cheapen everything else. You give these states the opportunity to have a discourse in which to say, well, you know, we have to pick between two of the fundamental rights, and that's a legal thing to do. When you can pick between two fundamental rights, you're allowed to discriminate the other one. We're letting these states say, well, you know, the internet is a fundamental right of life, so we'll just give them internet and let them die instead. Because, you know, we don't really like them. That's how these laws work. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Yes.
So you say that the moment we granted people freedom of speech, we implicitly and directly gave them less food and water because they are stripping away.
Yes. I'll say yes. But the problem is you give these states the opportunity to create a discourse in which they can discriminate other fundamental rights because they need to give internet, for example. Even more, we think it cheapens the very idea of these rights. We think that the moment people put out there that, you know, you have the right to go on YouTube, you don't think about, you know, how other people are currently dying in Africa because they have no food. How about you spend all that time saving those children? How about you spend all that time, you know, trying to make these current rights that we have be universal? We have all these rights that are not respected out the world. Freedom of speech in Tajikistan, freedom of speech in many Central Asian states, right? How about we work on getting all these rights respected and then to come up with new ideas. That's what I tell them. And I think that it just cheapens everything. The internet itself is just a tool for your expression. But if we don't respect even the freedom of expression, how do we even want to do that? And I think Logan talked to you enough about how, we're not just going to get cars and phones because we think, moral imagination has changed. It's time that I have the right to chocolate, okay? So at the end of the day, they have never proved why the internet is essential for you to live a happy, fulfilled, and easy life, okay? And we think that we've proven how it cheapens everything. So that's why do not vote for them.
Order, please. No nationalistic slurs directed towards the speakers. Order, please.
Right, so I'm a bit confused because the opposition's line of refutation against whatever OG has been telling us is that a right becomes fundamental when it is inherent and irrevocable for human survival. We tell you the internet is irrevocable and inherent to human survival. Just understand this. The next idea that they tell you is that if something is not good all the time, it doesn't have to be fundamental. You can die if you go inside Lake Isikul deep enough. Doesn't mean water stops being a fundamental human right. Just because a fundamental human right, just because something can be harmful or have pernicious effects on society does not stop it from making it fundamental. If you eat enough beef, you will probably die. If you drink enough alcohol, you will probably die. But it does not stop food from being a fundamental human right. It's not just alcohol. If you abuse food, if you abuse your medicine, if you abuse your education to make bombs and kill people and stuff, you still are abusing your fundamental human rights. Or we hold you accountable for that abuse, and we don't take away and we don't make a right not fundamental because some people have scope of abuse. It does not necessarily follow that. The next idea that these people talk about is cheapening other rights. And this is where we bring in the idea of human dignity. Because opening government simply told you about how this enhances other rights, like right to assembly, right to free speech, so on and so forth. We take it one level beyond that. And we tell you that internet is essential for right to human dignity. Why is that? The internet allows you to actualize what you really want to do. What this essentially means is internet helps you be the kind of person who you are. Yuan might be able to live in this world without the internet, but most people cannot live in the world without the internet, given that they have the means to access the internet. Because people that have means to access information but cannot be able to access such information has a stunting of their intellectual growth. What this essentially means is if you have every single resource that exists with you and you are denied the access to internet, what essentially this means is that you lose the capacity of you to interact with individuals, to discuss ideas, to discuss knowledge, and to become greater intellectual individuals. Stop shaking your head, Sina. But essentially, the idea that we're telling you, and I'm pretty sure the op is going to probably ask you, well, even if we don't make it a fundamental human right, states don't take it away. But this is where we draw a distinction. Once we make this a fundamental human right, it is going to press other regimes, it's going to press governments who take away internet, and we're going to hold them accountable. Why do we provide rights to individuals, or why do we provide fundamental human rights? We don't provide them so that they can magically start raining out of the sky like bread. We give people fundamental human rights so that nobody, no institution can take them away from certain individuals. Why is this particularly important? We're not talking about giving everybody internet, because guess what? Coming from a developing nation, I know too damn well people who have never seen computers in their life use this magical technology and get online. What happens in these countries? Oftentimes governments will choose to take away this internet from you. We tell you when that happens, this is a violation of his right to live with full human dignity, because the kind of resources that he was erstwhile, with the kind of resources that he currently has, he cannot lead the life that he was previously leading without any fault of his own. I'm going to take Logan.
So if you want totalitarian regimes like China to give people the internet, are they more likely to do it if you call it a fundamental human right, or if you just keep quiet and let them do what they do?
We think if you keep pressuring countries like North Korea, like China, like Iran, and you tell them it's a fundamental human right, and when we tell you that the people in China, in Iran, in North Korea believe that they should have access to internet, we think that the state, whatever the state believes, is irrelevant when the state stops representing the will of the people, and we think the people's will of access to internet becomes a prerogative. What essentially this means is, when states stop providing internet access to you, it is your prerogative, it is your duty, being an outside observer, to push those agents to provide internet, to provide access to internet to your people, to go ahead yourself and break the Great Wall of China per se. But more importantly, this idea of people in oppressive regimes. Now when in developing nations your right to internet is taken away, because essentially what we're trying to do is prevent nations from taking away your access to internet. When the state takes away your access to internet, it almost always necessarily follows that your other rights are going to be taken away. What rights are these? It almost always follows that your right to free speech will be taken away, your right to movement will be taken away, your right to life will be taken away. And who is going to take away these rights? Usually, when oppressive regimes take away your right to internet, it almost always follows that they are trying to, that the state mechanism is working against you to take away your rights. The state mechanism is working against you in times of civil war, in times of totalitarian regimes that do not want to empower you. Why is this particularly important? We tell you the moment we allow states to take away such rights without us having the high ground of calling bullshit on them, essentially what we're allowing them to do is oppress their people. What happens when we oppress their people? What happens when we allow states to keep oppressing their people? These people need an outlet to let the world know, to let the state know that they're violating their rights, but then if the state fails them, they need to let the outside world know what is happening in their own country. In both cases, we see the internet is absolutely crucial for their human survival, because when the state is taking away their internet, it almost always follows that the state is going to violate some more rights of theirs. This is a sign that the state is cooking up something pernicious, like a civil war, like crackdown on minorities. We believe that by enshrining internet as a fundamental human right, we put more and more pressure on nations so that they don't take away internet or the access of internet from people.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Closing opposition today believes that the benefits that side government has been highlighting on both sides of government aren't actually true. And the internet does not promise the fancy benefits and fancy illustrations that they do. But first, before we get into that, quick rebuttals. Number one, ladies and gentlemen, closing government said that sitting on the internet somehow enhances your intellectual growth. We do not think that that necessarily is true, because a large bulk of people, like opening said, sit there and watch kitties. So therefore that does not necessarily follow that sitting on the internet for large periods of time will necessarily increase your IQ. The second thing they said, ladies and gentlemen, was that in oppressive regimes, when the internet is taken away, other rights will also be eventually taken away. We want to understand that if these oppressive regimes are eventually going to take away all your rights, or are in the process of taking away rights, why are they going to in any way honor this right to the internet and therefore your right to speech? And therefore we believe that on their argument that oppressive regimes will in fact be better with the right to internet. We do not think that if they aren't guaranteeing other rights, they are unlikely to guarantee this one as well.
But the other thing that both these sides have been harping on, such as right to education, right to water, and other things, are necessarily civic rights and not necessarily fundamental in nature. But we are not going to get into that terminology because that's extremely messy. But first and foremost, how does the internet not provide benefits of democracy and changing revolutions, ladies and gentlemen? We tell you that in the Arab Spring, what has eventually happened? Eventually, a bunch of Islamists have come into power and they are restricting the rights of their people. Therefore, having an internet-charged revolution necessarily does not follow that you will get democracy. Look at Russia and China. Both of them have the internet, but do you have more free speech? Do you have democracies fully and functional in those areas? We think that is not true. And therefore, simply the presence of the internet does not imply that you will get democracy. Also, ladies and gentlemen, look at Ukraine, and we think that revolutions in countries can also happen without the internet. Look at the revolution that happened in Ukraine and Serbia. Both of them came fully successful without the presence of the internet. And therefore we believe, ladies and gentlemen, that it does not necessary for the internet to exist to provide the necessary benefit. Finally, ladies and gentlemen, we think that even if you were to argue that the internet somehow will provide these benefits, calling it a fundamental right would necessarily not imply that authoritarian regimes will give its people those rights, especially if authoritarian regimes are not granting you other rights. They aren't granting you freedom of speech, they aren't granting you free and fair elections, they aren't even guaranteeing you fair wages. Why will they guarantee you this right? And we don't think that without this absence of this right, the benefits that these guys are trying to portray will not necessarily follow, because this right will not be provided in the first place by these rights. The second thing that we want to highlight over here is that access to the billions of people in the world is not something anyone should be guaranteeing you. That means that you have a right to free speech, but free speech to billions of people is not something anyone has to guarantee you. And therefore we believe that the internet is not something anyone should be guaranteeing you, because if the idea is that you can speak to a large number of people, then why must any government or any body guarantee you that? I'll take close in.
So because China and Russia does not give you right to free speech, does that stop right to free speech from being a fundamental human right?
Sit down, sir. That is not what this debate is about. The point is that even where the internet exists, there aren't benefits. So what we're trying to say is that simply calling something a fundamental right will not guarantee the mechanisms that exist in those areas. In fact, what happens is the reverse. What happens is that something like happened during the Indian subcontinent independence. You had a fully functional constitution, you had a fully functional democracy, but the people did not know what to vote on. People did not realize the power of their votes. And so 60 years later on, you still have people fighting for their rights, not knowing what to do. And this is what happens. If you guarantee the right to internet without basic rights being there, of electricity, of computers, of education, then we think that what you are doing is skewed prioritization. Your resources are going somewhere else, and therefore the fuller utilization of the internet will never take place, and hence the benefits being provided by those sides aren't necessarily going to happen. We also believe, ladies and gentlemen, that what is more important is not access to billions, but in fact access to within your community. And therefore if you want these sort of community building and democratic changes, what you should be doing is interacting within your community and not to the broad world in general. And we think that that is very much possible without the internet, and there's nothing exclusive in the internet that will guarantee you that. On another level, ladies and gentlemen, we think what this does is that it limits the bargaining power in the international community. That means that if fundamental rights are being violated, then you should, and violations by other countries, then you should be pressuring on more important issues, certainly such as elections, such as freedom of speech, such as fair wages, such as freedom of movement. And if those are things that are being restricted, then the international community as a whole should focus its bargaining power there rather than its bargaining power on the internet. And what we think that this does is it overall dilutes the value of the internet and therefore that of the bargaining power, and hence your resources and prioritization will be skewed as an international community as a whole. We also think, ladies and gentlemen, that if the government is going to guarantee this, there are other things before this that need to be guaranteed, such as electricity, such as computers, such as access to proper fully functional infrastructure. We think unless that is there, this right is just a skip. So what is going to happen is that, okay, internet is a fundamental right, but people don't have the internet. And if that is what's going to happen, then there is no point in this symbolic representation of the internet being a fundamental right. What is going to happen is that you have right to housing, but there are homeless people. What is the point of such a change is what we are trying to drive here. We therefore think that the benefits that these guys are trying to drive aren't necessarily accruable to the internet or necessarily follow from the internet. And even if they do follow, the resources in the current scenario demand that we focus on other things rather than the internet, ladies and gentlemen. And we think that as an international community, we have better things to focus on, more important things to focus on, rather than the flimsy and inaccurate benefits that side government has been trying to bring. And on those grounds, ladies and gentlemen, side opposition is proud to oppose.
Apparently we do this. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I am not confused. Ratif was confused, but I'm pretty sure that we are right. Why am I saying so? Because the opposition bench today are making a lot of assumptions, bad assumptions on the way we grant rights, why we do them in the first place, how this can make your life better, but even more importantly, how this can prevent abuse from those that have power. Right? So in my speech, I will show you that internet is not just something nice to have, but something that you must have in order to survive, in order to be able to reach your full potential, in order to be able to fight abuse and abuse of power from the government, which is the reason why rights were invented in the first place. Firstly, what we hear today is when we give human rights to people, and the government has shown you speech after speech how as we evolve, as we discover that it is more about human life than just, being alive, not starving and having water, we start to see this as the new threshold, the new minimum common thing that we should all have. So this is how society functions, right? We want the best for us, not just meaningly being alive. Also, they say that a right has to be inherently good in order to be granted, which is false. We give many rights, freedom of expression, mobility, marriage, assembly, that are sometimes abused. That's why we police them, we regulate them, but we don't take them away. Also, they say that human rights should be inherently useful because, otherwise people just watch kitties. We don't care. At the same time, people are accessing opportunities, are accessing information, are crying out when their government is oppressing them. So just because every now and then I allow myself to see meow meow doesn't mean that I do not do great things with the internet, right? So everything else falls. They also try to show that there is some sort of harm because it cheapens other rights. This is really not true. I don't see any mechanism shown by Logan how when women were granted the right to vote, all of a sudden all the other rights became less important. It is the opposite. When you give more and more rights, the exigencies of the people are increasing. People are more aware of what they deserve, right? So they hold their government more accountable. It doesn't mean that the government all of a sudden will neglect your other rights. No, it means that the people will have a higher sense of entitlement and a higher sense of what they need and what they deserve, and they will ask for it. So no harm. No, thank you, Logan, not now. Also, they have probably 3 speeches on the topic of how some bad countries won't really care about this. Well, here, and they won't do anything about it, here we have more things to say. First, we believe in incremental change. Of course that China will not be, all of a sudden impressed and say, yeah, sure, please do so. However, we believe that when you enshrine a right, when you make it something fundamental, then the international community does have more muscle in trying to convince those authoritarian regimes that they should change. But moreover, even if they fail in doing so, people from China, people from Syria, they do know about this, even if their governments don't want them to know. So actually you empower them, you send them the message that it is okay to break the Great Wall of China, even if your government doesn't allow you to do so, right? So once you make it a right, even if your government doesn't give you that right, you become more aware of how others have it and you don't have it, and you ask for it. And this will call for incremental change. Yes?
If the internet, as you say, is as fundamental as things like political representation, sexual orientation, religion, why don't other people deny these rights by just saying, those are also things we're not developed yet to have? We don't have the infrastructure, so let's not give people political representation.
The problem is that the opposition bench kept saying that we don't have the right infrastructure, and as Ratif has showed you in his speech, it is problematic, especially because we do have the infrastructure. Even if the poorest villages in India and Bangladesh, some people have internet on the phone, so it is not a matter of provision of infrastructure. In many places you do have it in place, but the government chooses to strip you away from access to internet. And this is where it becomes problematic. Because in this speech, on this part of the government, we're not saying that tomorrow tomorrow all the governments should make sure that everybody has Wi-Fi and an Apple computer. No, we're saying that once you make it a human right, the government should not be allowed to take it away from you, especially that you already have it in many cases, right? And now I'm going to talk about, no thank you, now I'm going to talk about what Ratib has shown you. It is not only nice to have, it is not only great that you can fulfill your other rights, that you have access to opportunities, information, but it is this unique instrument that allows you to cry out when someone else is abusing you, and that someone else is usually the government. How much time do I have? Yes, please go.
So what you're saying is that we don't have to give them education, it's just that once they have education, we can take it away, right? Because that's what we're doing with the internet.
That's what we mostly do in the internet. Some people have access in authoritarian regimes to the internet, and the moment they choose to post videos on police beating up citizens, the government takes it away. So this is actually the first instance when you can see it is government abusing even when the infrastructure is in place. Also, what Ratib has tried to show you today is that internet is this unique place that allows you to cry out when there is abuse, right? Which means that whenever there are revolutions, protests, government abusing their power, if you take internet away from them, they will lose this unique avenue through which they can cry out for help to the international community. So not only that you strip them away from accessing information, opportunities, all these nice things, you're actually stripping them away from the very survival things, right? They're getting beaten up, they not have access to food, to education, because you take this instrument away. So that's why we believe that this is the moment where it stops being just a mere instrument, it becomes that air that allows you to cry out for help. This is why it should be a fundamental human right. Yes?
So you're saying that when the government starts beating up its people, it will still give it internet because it's a fundamental human right?
No. I'm saying that when the government is beating you up and you have access to internet, you're more likely to get help from the outside.
Here, here.
So what we have told you today is, firstly, the way we grant people human rights is, sorry.
6 minutes gone.
So I have one more. I'm sorry. So what we have been telling you today is the way they understand that we grant people human rights is completely wrong. We do it based on their needs, their interests, and the way they can fulfill their full potential. Also, we grant people human rights in order to prevent abuse, and the internet allows for this. Secondly, there is no harm they showed on the opposition bench, because it is not cheapening other rights. We think that it only enhances them, and it only makes people more aware of what they deserve and what they need. And incrementally, they will ask this from their government. That's why Chinese people are actually accessing Facebook, even if it's forbidden. That's why they break the Great Wall of China, even if the government is really, really trying to impose it. So you give people, this message that you can do it, even if Big Daddy doesn't allow you to do so. Thirdly, we think that it's not only nice to have, but it is a must-have, because it's this channel that is unique and that allows you to cry out for help when you need it. And this is the reason why human rights were invented, to prevent abuse, and internet can help you in that. Thank you.
Well, I'm going to say 3 things. They may sound controversial, but they're quite true. First, the internet isn't that great. Second, the internet's not the best way to get change, and naming things human rights are not the best ways to get change. Finally, the internet isn't really the thing that matters at all. First of all, the government has given us 4 basic reasons why the internet, in their view, needs to be a human right. Because it gives you access to knowledge, access to what was called dignity, access to what is called expression, and the far more plausible one that we get in the whip speech, which is that it allows you to cry out for help. Let's look at them one by one. Knowledge. Google has made our memory go away because we don't bother needing to remember anything at all. Google Maps has eliminated the need to remember where I live and which bus to take home. More importantly, however, the internet has brought on... No, thank you, Otto. What the internet has done is that it has replaced the Britannica Encyclopedia, or universities, or knowledge and authoritative resources with things like Wikipedia, where anybody around the world can wake up in the morning and go, oh, this is what the truth is, without any veracity, without any fact-checking, without anything. Sir. On the subject of dignity, has anyone ever been on Facebook and looked at what sort of photos usually get up there? Clearly, the least dignified moments of your lives are publicly broadcasted and accessible so that advertisers in the West can profit from them and sell you things based on what the color of your underwear were on a fashion show at the Asia Youth Forum. No, thank you. The thing is, clearly, the internet does not serve dignity whatsoever. Expression. All the internet has done is add to, for instance, the ability of anonymous people to post hate and slurs, even in cases where you actually have revolutions, what usually comes out, no thank you, is confusing messages where Gaddafi has been killed by Twitter 3 times before the BBC kills him on, where Assad has gone to the same fate. Clearly, we have seen that this expression has led to confusion when, for instance, Syrian people go out on the streets to celebrate Assad's death, to figure out that Assad is pretty much alive and kicking and get a bullet in the head as a result. Moreover, it is forced to assume that most people actually care about the sort of things that government talk about online. Logan talks about kitties, right? And a lot of this has been talked about, but it is fundamentally true that more people have watched Gangnam Style and Justin Bieber than anything of any sort of value online, right? When Margaret Thatcher finally died this week, people on Twitter believed that Sir had died, the singer, because both are spelled C-H-E-R, and they couldn't tell Thatcher from that Sir, right? That shows to how much Twitter has contributed to democratic discourse on a global perspective. Go, Sams.
You compare a world where it exists and a world where it doesn't exist. WikiLeaks is not going to happen without internet. Anonymous is not going to happen without internet. So arguing by example.
What's the good that WikiLeaks has brought when diplomats around the world are afraid to hold meetings with other diplomats for the sheer fear that Julian Assange might post them out of context online? Contributed to government transparency when, in fact, all we get now, for instance, is cables taken out of context, right? The worst of international relations is certainly kept still secret because clearly it isn't Prince whoever it was from the United Kingdom getting drunk in a meeting of Kazakhstan and calling your president a buffoon. Now, finally, this idea that it's all about crying for help, right? So we find that to be the most plausible argument given by the government side, right? Twitter is something that you can cry out for help on. Fine. First, if you're getting beaten up in Cairo and you're crying out for help on Twitter, and I read it in my cozy London bedroom, there's very little I can do to help you, right? Second, you're probably far more likely to get the same amount of help if you're able to access a phone and text someone that's within the same area. Third, the people that can actually help you aren't even on Twitter. Second, how do you best get change, right? So I come from Greece, right? I come from a country that has police brutality and democratic deficits, all of that wonderful stuff, right? The problem is that the people that actually vote in elections are not the people that are online. When you want to affect change in your country, when you want to affect change in your circumstances, you have to do that on the streets. You don't have to do that on Facebook. If China allowed people to go on Facebook, right, and it's a large misconception that everyone in rural China even knows what Facebook is, but let's give them the benefit of the doubt. Even if you give access to people in China to go on Facebook, unless those very same people decide to get off their asses and go out on the street to protest, to make change actually happen, there's no actual way you'll actually convince masses of people to go out on the streets. We've seen that in Greece, the country that has been the most terribly affected by the global economic crisis, that is going through severe austerity and the worst of policies known to man in the democratic West. We see only 10 to 20,000 people go out on the street, matching the amount of people that complain about it online, and nothing really happens. But even more importantly, right, let's talk about the sort of place they want us to talk about. The awful, dictatorial regimes. Let's see how change actually happens. China embraces the internet as a means to boost its productivity, as a means to affirm its position as an economic global superpower. That's the only reason China gave internet to its citizens. It didn't do it because it gave a toss about whether or not the people are free in China. No, thank you. China did that not on the premise of the West barking down on them and going, you have to do this because it's a human right. The only reason China did it is because they thought it would be profitable by their own volition. A country that we've tried bullying into doing things is Iran, which is far more repressive than China is at the moment. A country that we've tried to bully into doing things is North Korea, that is threatening the entire world with nuclear war at the moment. The way to bring about change is to try and cooperate with these regimes rather than try to force them into doing things, right? But even if we don't think that they have any sort of political capital to get people to give their citizens access to the internet, given that if freedom of expression is a basic human right, we haven't really been very successful in doing that either. Finally, why is it that the internet isn't the thing that matters, right? Russia gives its citizens near unlimited access to the internet, right? Israel gives its citizens completely unlimited access to the internet. Both of these countries have severe democratic deficits, where in Russia, it is very unlikely that we can talk about a meaningful democracy. In Israel, there's scores of people, thousands of people that aren't even allowed to vote on the basis of who they are, where they come from, right? The internet doesn't tell you for democracy. The internet doesn't really affect change. The internet is definitely not a human right. Thank you.
For a speech, and invite you to give one more round of applause to all 8 of our speakers this evening. Now, while they're all shaking hands, we're going to do an incredibly undemocratic, non-internet-based poll. I want to do a show of hands for who thinks which side won. So first of all, if you think the proposition side won, please raise your hand and say aye.
Aye!
And if you think the opposition side won, please raise your hand and say nay. Hashtag upwin.
That's unfair.